Good day, Bear fans, and welcome, Coyote fans. My TR6060 has a usable wiring harness. How did I get here? How did I make that happen? Tune in to find out. Now, this is the transmission without a wiring harness on it. Now, I've got to make a wiring harness that fits this transmission and comes out roughly here. Looking at the body, my plan is to run the wiring up along the firewall, zip tied to here, out to here, the connector somewhat in here. So I've got to measure this distance and give myself enough room to run it. This is a transplant, so this car did not come with a TR6060. It came with a T5. Much smaller transmission, and this wiring harness stay was nowhere near big enough to fit the transmission. These loops on here were similar in size. I had to drill them out, and I had to do a little bit of surgery, like cut it, splice another, I think it was an inch or so into it. Now, in my parts list, you'll find a set of connectors for a T56. That set of connectors was good for 2 of the 3 connectors that you see here. There's actually a 4th item, which is going to be down here. There's a drain plug for the TR6060, and in that drain plug I'm going to mount a temperature sender for the transmission temperature. So that has to be accounted for too. So really there's 4 pairs of wires coming off. We've got a reverse lockout wire so that whenever the car is stopped I can put it in reverse. There's the reverse wire, which whenever the car goes into reverse, this is the thing that turns on the rear lights. And then finally, I had to order from, this is on my parts list too, from American Muscle, this speed sensor wire, which goes into here. It's the speed sensor itself. It didn't come on this transmission. And I was kind of panicked for a second here because the plug that I had that came with these other 2 wires, there was 3. One of them was for this sender, but it turns out the stock sender fits that plug. So this is what remains of my good old transmission wiring harness. Let's take a look at that thing again. It's been in other videos, okay? There ain't much left, alright? We have the main plug, which has, as previously discussed, pins 2 and 3 staked together. If you don't have those together, the car will not send a start signal to the car to start. There's our speed sensor wiring with our special speed sensor plug that I don't want to lose now that I found out just how rare it is. Here's a wire that I'm going to have to cut and splice into that reverse, and then finally there isn't the two left on here. We do have enough wires to do it, but the 2 that I want on this plug are missing, and they are for the transmission temperature sender and for the reverse lockout, because the T5 had no such luxury. So I need to get with the program here and make up a wiring harness. Well, this is the transmission extension wire that you'll find embedded in a 4.6 or a 3.8 wiring harness for a new Edge. And it's kind of sponsored by the Department of Redundancy Department. It's basically a 1-to-1 connector. Like, you could use this as an extension to your current, just what it is, basically plugged in line. an extension to the wiring harness for the car. And basically I measured about 30 inches. That puts that connector right about there, okay? Which is good because that allows me to kind of, you know, reach where I need to go. The only thing I really don't care for is the way this is running. I'll have to come up with some way to do a loop and have that run nicely. I've got a connector here that I can use. I can run, possibly join, maybe, you know, come through under, who knows, over here to this. All of this is going to have sheathing on it. Anyways, all of this is me thinking about the serviceability of the car. You know, basically, these connectors are all made in such a way that if I had to change that solenoid or fix this reverse switch or whatever, I don't have to cut into my wiring harness. I can just unplug. And then I'm going to repurpose 4 of these wires. 2 of them I know about, 2 pairs. I know the reverse, and I know this vehicle speed sensor. I do not have one for this or for the 2 wires that come off of the temperature sensor. So I just have to repurpose 2 pairs of these wires. Actually, there is 1 extra wire. It's really going to be 5 wires because the original wiring harness uses, where are you at? It uses 1 wire. This orange wire plugs into this trans. This is basically a bunch of O2 sensors came through this that were not coming out that way. So I'm going to rerun this wire and find this connector and clip that wire out of it and run it to the other side of the one that's on the body harness for the car, which looks like this. You know, using one of the wires that's not used here. You can see I've got a bunch of connectors that are not used. So like pin 13 is plugged up here. You can see it. Or maybe you can't, but it's there. And there's a wire I could use like pin 13 because it's not used in the final transmission wire. So then going on the other side of it, I can, well, let's just go take a look. See if they're all populated. They're all populated. So I could clip pin 13 on the other side of this and wire it to the orange wire that's here, that wire. Okay? And then I can pretty much forget about this connector. It's not needed anymore. Similar kind of thing here, we'll get to it. That's overkill for the number of wires I'm running, that engine connector. But anyways, the idea is I'll have a connector that connects up this this transmission to the body. So if I ever have to pull the transmission, I'm just disconnecting that connector. I don't have to worry about anything else. And I have a similar philosophy for this guy. I'll use the original engine wiring that I've got kind of running loosely here for some of it, but I may use a different connector. Just one, though, that will run under the engine, probably zip tied to the K-member and coming out, I'm thinking over here, probably up the body over into this area up here. So it'll come up here, probably run along here into some connector that's much smaller than that. So that's just massive. Anyways, we're having fun. This is coming along, and I will get this wiring kind of buttoned up here. Hopefully have it on high speed for you to work. Well, here we are. So to reiterate, at this point, I'm trying to do my transmission wiring, and you need a connector to connect up the transmission, because if you ever need to pull the transmission separate from the engine, you don't want to have to sort the differences out. Nice to have just one connector. This connector is embedded. This is really just the extension connector that's embedded in a wiring harness for a new Edge 99 to 04 Mustang. Pins 2 and 3 are wired together for a manual transmission. I believe on an automatic that's what's used to signal that you can start the car. I'm not sure. And I labeled the rest of my pins. Only, I think it's 3 of which are stock. The vehicle output speed sensor wiring is stock, and the reverse signal wire is stock. The signal return wire, which I think might just be a positive wire, I'm not sure, is going to have to be relocated from another connector. Let's see if I've got the other transmission connector in sight here. I do. Okay. On the stock connector, and I know this looks messy, and I'm sorry, but if you're going to do one of these, you're going to have to get used to wiring. That is an O2 sensor plug. There's a bunch of O2 sensors that run their signal wiring through that, and for whatever reason, they reuse this. You can see it. It comes right off the transmission plug, and it runs right to this plug, which I believe on the back of the transmission is where they put a whole bunch of O2 sensors, so I'm sure that's why this is that way. But we just want one plug, not 2. So this wire here that runs to the reverse switch, I'm going to relocate. See if I can show it here without too much trouble. That guy there has an orange wire on it. See that wire? Okay, I'm going to relocate that to, if you notice, all of these wires are plumbed. Even though on a stock V6 Mustang, only about 5 of these wires are used. So they go into the car somewhere, and I'm going to figure out where. They might actually end somewhere. I'm not positive where they end, but it could be they run all the way to the PCM. So at this point, though, I need to relocate that orange wire, or even just tap into it and run it to that wire. So that'll give me 4 of my 8 wires required for my new wiring harness, which is, again, I cut the extension wire that runs through the normal engine wiring harness that plugs in here. It's the same plug, thankfully, to plug into that, okay? And that's your transmission wiring. Okay, so of these wires, a bunch of them are unused, and I've labeled them unused. I'm probably going to use the wires just for stiffness of this wiring harness since it's so light. Anyways, let's go over them. I've got a couple of wires for these are documented on a spreadsheet, by the way, that I'll put in the description of the video. I've got my pin that I've got to relocate. I've got my 2 wires for the vehicle output speed sensor, the 1 wire for the transmission reverse, and then I've got 4 more wires that I've used pin 12 and 14, I believe, for my temperature sender, and the 2 wires for a Cobra that are unused on the V6 for my let me find them here. Reverse lockout negative, and I've got a reverse lockout positive. So one of them is pin 13 and reverse pin 6, reverse lockout return. So the way I understand that this wiring normally works on a Cobra, which had a T56, which is similar to this TR6060, is power. When you turn the key on, power was supplied to this solenoid, but not the ground to this. I'm pointing to it now. That's my reverse solenoid, which I've gone through and validated that it works. Okay, the last thing I want to do is put my transmission in my car and find out, oh hey, that solenoid's not working. I had some plug issues. Validated that my reverse lockout works. Validated that my backup lamp switch works. This one lets you put the thing in reverse. This one connects 2 pins together when the car goes into reverse. But the way this works, this red wire on this particular switch is for positive, and it gets power, but it doesn't get a ground. And when you put the car in reverse, or when you go to stop or something and the car's allowed to go in reverse, then the ground activates this solenoid. That's the way a Cobra works. Okay, so I've gone through all that. Now I have to build a functional wiring harness, and the final piece of the puzzle is to get the lengths right, because basically I need about 6 inches extra length from where those wires are sitting there to each of these. So for example, this one's going to need to be spliced about another 4 inches. This guy here is going to need about 12 inches, and this guy here is going to need about probably 20 inches. And then I haven't plumbed up my temperature sender gauge. That guy needs probably 3 feet. All of these I'm going to tie together and make a really factory stock looking harness. Basically what I'm saying is I'm going to cover everything back with conduit and electrical tape, and it will look pretty factory, and plug up to the factory plug with, like I said, 5 modifications, one of them being the signal return relocated from this as discussed, and then 4 more wires I've got to figure out. 2 of them are temperature sender and 2 of them are reverse lockout. They run, I think, all the way on the inside of the car. I'll find that out, but they're going to go through 1 plug when I'm done. Joy. Let's keep going. Alright, well, wiring harness is coming together. I've got all my sensor mounted now. Let's see if I can get that on camera. It's down way low. I don't know if you can see it there. Hopefully you can. I had to find a ground, and I'm going to have to check the continuity from this ground that I've created here to that casing on that sensor. Alright, if it's not contiguous, I'm going to have to relocate my ground. But I kind of like where that ground is, just from a convenience standpoint. Allows me to kind of join these wires together. I've got to sheath all this, so probably I'm going to cut some of this stuff and run sheathing back on stuff. Gives me a chance to try out some new toys. It's nylon sheathing. We'll see if it goes where I want it to go. I've got all my connectors as previously described wired here. I've got them kind of joining up right about here on the transmission housing, and so I've got to get all this kind of put together and put conduit and sheathing on it and make it look, you know, factory is my goal. I do have this connector spot here that I could use, but more to the point, I've got that guy there which I can use to run everything together, and then come up onto this bad boy, which I previously discussed as a redo of the V6 mount for the transmission. So I can, because of the way this is, I can run the connector up and out here. I can kind of mount it to this. It'll be nice, trust me. Alright, once it's mounted to that, whenever I put the transmission in the car, I can run that to this connector here, and there's plenty of connector to be had. It almost can go right here. I just want to tuck everything so it doesn't show, is the main thing. Still have some work to do figuring out where these run. Judging by the relative sizes of these pins on these wires, I'm going to guess that somewhere inside this wiring harness they truncate and get rid of some pins. In which case I'm going to have to find some wire unused on our big connector here to run several wires into the car. I've got 2 extra sensors on that plug, the original factory wiring plug, that are a water temperature and an oil pressure that go on the engine. And I have a differential temperature sensor which will run from the back of the car up to the front. So all this stuff, you know, can you reuse the plug don't do what I did on my first round, which was to add a whole bunch of extra plugs. Okay. Your idea here is you're going to pull this engine out maybe at some point in the future, or some other poor guy, maybe your grandkids are going to have to work on it, and have just one plug for the engine and one plug for the transmission extra from the Barra wiring, which will be the, in this case, stock engine wiring, rather engine wiring. So all this is, you know, me going from 8 years of driving a Coyote swap and some of the confusion I created for myself. It'd be best, in my eyes, to document all your wiring and have everything understood, so that when you go to use the car and you ever have to work on it, you can easily diagnose stuff. So that's where we're at. I've just got to do some wrapping and tying now to get what appears to be factory wiring harness out of this bad boy. Okay, so hopefully this time I'll have saved the footage on my high speed, so you guys can watch me do that. It's not thrilling work, but again, like a lot of my videos, I'm not here to thrill people. For those of you that are like, God, how do I do this? I'm trying to show you what I did. It's the best thing, who knows? But for me, it worked for so many years. And you know, I look at other people's stuff, and you know, this is what I think is the best way to go. So let's get started doing our final tie-up of this wiring harness. I'm going to have to extend some of these wires so that they reach, again, this destination above the transmission here. And I'll probably just leave this lay here while I get that wiring done. And then when I'm all done, I'm going to unbolt these connectors that I made for that. And get all my connectors loose, basically, labeled, and tie everything up in some nice shrink wrap and sheathing, and then put it back on the transmission, and it should look pretty kosher. So, hope you're enjoying the ride. Alright, well, this turned out pretty good so far. I'm halfway through making the harness for the transmission, and I've been using this nylon conduit. It's very nice, looks professional. You can tell it's actually protecting the wiring. One of the things that I've had to do is extend the wiring length for a lot of these connectors. And so I'm trying to keep wire colors the same, but that's difficult, or if not impossible. So I've been using a label maker, which will show up on video, to label the wires as I know them, because I know what colors they go to. The harness is going to come together here at the top of the transmission. It'll be pinned to the sides of the transmission, and it'll come out on this this carrier over here, and then off into this part of the car, which is right behind me. But I gotta take a break. I'm going to meet some friends. So literally down to just getting this thing roughed in. It's probably another hour of work for me, and I'll have an actual transmission wiring harness, which is going to be a beautiful thing. And then I can set some other things in motion and actually mount this transmission to the engine. Get that. and do some basic calibration of the clutch and the hydraulic throwout bearing, which comes out over here. So beautiful stuff, but I've got to take it as it comes. And one of the things I came across is my transmission guy Jeremy recommends GM Synchromesh or Royal Purple Synchromesh, and I can't find it anywhere local. It's crazy. Summit carries it, of course, but you'd think it'd be something pretty straightforward to find. And that was one of the things. I need transmission fluid in the transmission, just like I need power steering fluid in the fluid reservoir of this guy, so that I don't burn up the pump when I start the motor. So, fun, but I want this harness done. I'm almost there. Let's pick up where I left off here. The next high speed should show me getting this thing finished. All right, so that's how that turned out. And bear in mind, the part of the wiring harness that I just did is the part coming up to here. We've already got this part, let me pull it down, labeled. All right, I've got some unused wire. Again, I'm using the transmission extension wire that's embedded in your harness to create the actual transmission harness. Why? It has all the wires already done in it. The stock transmission harness does not. And pull that thing out and I can show you. It's only got a relatively small number of those pins plumbed. And you're going to need more pins if you're doing what I'm doing, which is basically plumbing my temperature sender and of course an extra for this guy, the shift reverse lockout on a T56. It's what prevents you from shifting into 7th gear, which is reverse. That's where it naturally lands. So, and I could clip all these wires. They're unused. I'm actually going to leave them in for body on this connector. I just want it to be stronger. I've got my 8 wires labeled that I'm going to use, and I've got my 8 wires coming up here. Okay. So I'm set now to bring these together and have them come out basically off of this transmission brace. Okay. Yeah. So let's get that done. I'm going to use some of the transmissions. Got some pieces on it already to kind of handle this, and you know, it's there. I did some neat tricks here. I used my zip ties accordingly. Pieces that were already on the transmission that were part of the prior wiring harness, they're all on here. Okay, and there's holes and, you know, abutments made just for tucking this harness. Use them. That's what I would say. And anyways, I've got to get these hooked up to these. It's going to be 8 soldered connections, and then I'm going to tuck all of these wires into a larger piece of conduit. Probably not any of the conduit you see laying here. That's another thing. When you pull apart a wiring harness, you end up with a whole bunch of extra conduit. If you do it carefully, if you don't just throw it away. So save all that conduit so you can use it. It doesn't really go bad. It's just plastic, and you know, it doesn't. Nobody knows, you know, that you didn't just go out and buy new. I mean, it looks the same. So, anyways, we're going to do this final piece, and my transmission wiring harness will be done for my TR6060. All right, I'm going to put caps on these 5 wires here. These are the unused wires, and those will get embedded in this overall transmission harness. Okay, my pins 2 and 3 are capped together similar to the way they are from the factory on the original wire harness, which can be seen. For a manual transmission, let's see if we can spot it. There it is right there. Okay, I had to do it manually here. So 15 wires because one of them isn't plumbed. 8 of them used. 2 of them pinned together. That's 10. 5 left in my unused bundle. I just need some conduit. And I just had that piece of conduit. There it is. So this came off of the original wiring harness, either for the Barra or the Mustang. So I'm going to start at the connector end and work my way back to this end of it here. All my wiring is done, all my shrink wrap is done. I just want this transition from these connectors here on the transmission to the actual harness to be as smooth as possible. So we're done soldering now, we're done crimping, we're done with the barrel connectors. Speaking from a little bit of experience here, my first project I didn't use any kind of barrel connectors. I used weather packs a lot for any kind of connectors I needed to make, and I made a bunch of extra connectors. Here I'm trying to use as much of the factory connectors as possible, staying as true to the wiring as possible, documenting every pin. The difference is I want 2 connectors after the Barra wiring to be hooked up. One of them for the stock transmission harness, one of them for the stock engine harness. Then if I ever work on the engine, it's a matter of, you know, say I need to drop the engine and pull it out of the car, then I just have for the engine an engine harness, for the transmission a transmission harness. So I'm going to get to wiring this all up here very shortly, or rather finishing off my transmission harness. So it's a rather lengthy video, but if you ever need to make a transmission harness, you're probably going to want to watch this if you have a manual transmission. Don't know about how an automatic wiring job looks. Might be simpler, might be harder. Might be very, very similar. But there we are. Let's keep going. And that's pretty much it. I tested every pin, make sure that all my pins in my connector were where I wanted them to be. Okay, I used a regular continuity tester and just went through, disconnected each connector, or in the case of the temperature sender, the ground is exposed and so is the sending head. So it's pretty straightforward. You can disconnect each connector, check every pin. As you saw my connectors, each of the pins were labeled correctly. I caught one mistake. I had pin 8 and pin 9 confused on this connector, and when I tested them it didn't work, and I figured out it was on pin 8 instead of pin 9. I went back and checked my documentation. I had definitely wanted pin 9 rather, instead of pin 8. So I went and fixed that. Basically routed the wire for pin 9 to pin the wiring that I had done for pin 8 and capped it off. As you can see, this is a typical, looks almost factory at this point. And better than that, you know, each of these connectors, like say I needed to swap out this output speed sensor, I can disconnect this wire. If my reverse shifter backup lamp sensor goes out, I can service that without having to take, you know, the wiring harness off the car. Same with my reverse lockout and etc. Everything is serviceable. Okay, this is a rather long connector. It's going to lay on top of the motor once things are bolted together. That's very bulky in the factory. They don't do stuff like this, but you know, you're putting your own car together, you can do stuff like that. And even better, if you had to pull this whole wiring harness off the transmission, say in a service scenario, it will all come off and go back on at just the connector level. So I've cut my wires to length the way I want them, and I've got everything sort of, you know, protected the way that it should be. So that is how to do it, in my opinion. Again, this is how I kind of did it similar on my Coyote swap car. I was nowhere near as elegant at the wiring as I'm making it this time, trying to reuse connectors. And I think I'm getting exactly what I'm looking for. There's a lot of work here. There's probably like a good 4 hours of work over this weekend has been spent trying to get all this stuff. Probably more like 6 hours to try and make sure I had my pins right. I spent a couple hours online doing some research. All of that is going to be documented, actually in my BarraSwap documentation. And you're welcome to just look at that to see which pins I use to do which parts of this connecting setup. So, thank you for tuning in. Don't forget to subscribe, tell your friends, etc. I'm Paul Fair.